Awesome. Welcome, everyone. My name is Taylor Ward, she, her, and I am the Communications and Education Manager with Just Solutions. I am calling in from Seminole and Muskogee Land, otherwise known as Tampa, Florida. For those who don't know, Just Solutions is a national nonprofit that identifies and promotes just solutions to climate change from Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and frontline diasporas. We also provide informed analysis, reports, and more on the just solutions for an energy future that supports the replication of community developed, equitable, and just solutions. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on addressing indoor air quality with We Act for Environmental Justice. In today's event, we will be exploring We Act for EJ's out of gas and in with justice pilot and the lessons learned from this very important project. We'll discuss opportunities for policy change and review potential avenues to explore how indoor air pollution impacts communities. Lastly, we'll explore how communities can understand this topic in the context of federal policies. During today's event, we will also be live tweeting, so you can follow along on Just Solutions Twitter. Our Twitter name is @just_solutions_. You can share your takeaways from the webinar, post some questions, and tag us in those tweets or use our hashtag EJIndoors. Looking forward to seeing you on Twitter. And here is our agenda for today. So we're going to go through some introductions, which we're doing now. Then we'll have a presentation from Annie Carforo from We Act with EJ about the project and lessons learned. And then we'll have time for an audience question and answer session. So feel free to put any questions you have either in the chat or in the Q&A box. And then to introduce today's speaker, we have a presentation from Annie Carforo, the Climate Justice Campaigns Manager at We Act for EJ. She is responsible for engaging We Act members and residents of Northern Manhattan in the organization's climate policy initiatives. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Human and Organizational Development with a focus on community development from Vanderbilt University and is currently pursuing a Master of Urban Planning degree at Hunter College with a focus on equity and sustainability in city planning. And with that, I will turn it over to Annie.
Thank you, Taylor. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited to talk to you all about We Act's Out of Gas in with Justice pilot. For those of you that are not familiar with We Act, we are a community-based organization founded in West Harlem. We've been here for over 40 years fighting environmental racism in our community and have taken our advocacy beyond the borders of Harlem and have really addressed environmental justice issues in New York City, New York State, and now at the federal level. And so we are, working to advance healthy homes and communities for people of color, for low-income people across the country. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about some of our electrification work, looking towards transitioning our economy away from fossil fuels with a focus on affordable and low-income housing. We know that there is a lot of conversations happening at the local, at the state, and at the federal levels about how to get our economy off of burning fossil fuels for energy. But oftentimes that conversation leaves out the people that are most vulnerable to climate change and the people that are most impacted by both indoor and outdoor air pollution as a result of burning fossil fuels. And so that is kind of the premise of why we decided to do this pilot. And I'm really excited to talk to you all about what we did exactly, what we found, and kind of the policy implications of what we're looking to advance, thanks to the experiences that we had in this pilot project. So to get into it, Out of Gas in with Justice was a pilot project where we looked at the impacts on indoor air quality after transitioning homes in affordable housing from gas to induction stoves. And so this was the first study of its kind to focus on the effects of residential cooking electrifications with tenants in place in a public housing setting. So our pilot was conducted at 1471 Watson Avenue. This is a New York City housing authority, so a Section 9 housing HUD building in the Bronx, New York. this is this is public housing. This is the New York City Housing Authority's first pilot for an all-electric retrofit. So our housing authority in New York City is actually planning to fully electrify this building and use it as a model for how to electrify the rest of their building portfolio. And so that's where we decided to conduct our pilot and kind of help ease that transition away from fossil fuels. I'm going to get into a little bit about what exactly we did with the pilot, but we really wanted to look at electrification from a public health perspective, because we know that burning fossil fuels inside our homes has negative health impacts. There's tons of data, tons of research that show that. And we wanted to understand what that impact looked like in multifamily housing in New York City, which is a really densely populated urban area. So 1471 Watson Avenue, it's a 96 unit building, and we were working with about 20 of those units throughout this pilot project. So I kind of set us up a little bit at the beginning of this, but WeAct conducted this pilot in part because we have been advocating for many years for healthy housing. And so we believe at WeAct that everybody, regardless of race or income, is entitled to a home where they are free from health and safety threats and that they can thrive physically, mentally, socially, economically, and environmentally. It's becoming clear to us through our policy advocacy, through our work with our membership in Northern Manhattan, in West Harlem, that we have to commit to policies that are going to move our homes away from fossil fuels if we are going to realize healthy homes. And we're going to get into a little bit of why exactly we believe that. Some of the health motivation, public health perspective or motivations for doing this pilot are pretty well founded at this point, but also pretty startling when you kind of think about them. When you think about them, in reality, in a realistic setting. But we know that in New York City, buildings are a huge source of our greenhouse gas emissions. They're actually responsible for 70% of our greenhouse gases in New York City. And so any plans to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, meet climate goals, we need to be focusing on removing fossil fuels from our buildings. That's why, electrification of our existing housing stock is so important. I think another really interesting stat about New York City specific, but 90% of the buildings that are built right now are going to be here in 2050. So that means that we need to be really focused on what is already standing and how we get the fossil fuels out of those homes. But there are a lot of health implications for doing this work as well. Air pollution from buildings in New York State lead to, on average, 2,000 premature deaths annually. They also have really negative health impacts in terms of asthma. So in New York City, we have a higher asthma diagnosis than the national average at 10%. A recent study at the beginning of the year found that we can actually attribute almost 19% of childhood asthma cases to gas stoves in homes. And there's also evidence that shows that homes with gas stoves can increase a child's risk of developing asthma by 42%. And asthma is something that we focus on a lot because this is a really a disease that has a disproportionate burden on low-income communities and communities of color. And a really startling fact about New York City is that while 17% of children have experienced asthma-like symptoms, 80% of hospital visits for asthma in children identify as Black or Latinx, which means that this is a disease that is impacting specific neighborhoods, and there's a number of reasons why. There's a legacy of environmental racism, racist planning and land use and housing. But the reality in today's world is that communities of color are being impacted more by this disease due to higher rates of outdoor air pollution and indoor air pollution. And so they should and need to be targeted first for interventions that are going to improve air quality inside. If you look at this map on the left, this is New York City, our 5 boroughs, and it's showing the asthma hospitalization rates across the city. And you can see that historically Black neighborhoods like the Bronx, East Harlem, Southeast Queens have some of the highest rates of hospitalizations. And this yellow dot right here is the building where we conducted our study, just to kind of orient some of the folks here that are not from New York. So our study was measuring the impacts of 2 specific air pollutants. And we focused in on these air pollutants because there's a lot of evidence that showed that they are produced in high quantities when you're using a gas stove, and they have really negative health impacts. So the two air pollutants we were looking at were nitrogen dioxide and carbon monoxide. Nitrogen dioxide was a really important one because this is an air pollutant that is produced when you're burning methane, which is the gas that we use in our stoves. The gas industry likes to call it natural gas, but it's really just methane. And nitrogen dioxide can hurt the human respiratory tract. So that can increase the likelihood and severity of asthma, which, as I just mentioned, is a disease that really disproportionately burdens New York's communities of color. And the other air pollutant, carbon monoxide, many people have heard about that because in high concentrations, carbon monoxide can be deadly. But even low level exposure to carbon monoxide can exacerbate cardiovascular illness and can be really bad for your heart. And so in our study, we were really trying to focus in on these two air pollutants and looking at how households improve when you're removing gas stoves and replacing them with electric stoves. One other important thing to mention is that New York City has an incredibly old housing stock, and gas stoves can have more health impacts in homes that are older. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but oftentimes these homes are poorly ventilated. There are other issues that are exacerbating certain illnesses. So for example, many of these homes have issues of mold or lead or pests or toxins that can trigger asthma like symptoms that can compound with exposure to a gas stove. There's also an issue that some of these older buildings that are poorly maintained have inadequate heat. And we actually were able to see that some people were using their ovens to heat their apartments during the winter time, and that led to even worse air quality in those homes during that period of time. And it's not a coincidence, but low-income people and communities of color are more likely to live in housing with these conditions. And so again, that's kind of why we wanted to focus our electrification study in a neighborhood that we know deals with these issues of these housing issues, to understand the benefits that they would gain from electrification. Okay, on to our pilot. So our pilot reported the health and social impacts of transitioning from gas to induction stoves through 3 tests. The first was long-term kitchen air monitoring. So over a 10-month period, we monitored the air quality in people's homes on a day-to-day basis for a week at a time, 3 separate times, once at the beginning, once in the middle, and once at the end of this 10-month period, to just understand how day-to-day air quality changed when people transitioned away from gas appliances and towards electric appliances. We also conducted what's called a controlled cooking test, which really isolated the gas stove and the induction stove and was a snapshot of the air pollution that was being produced inside people's homes when using these 2 different appliances so that we could compare the difference. And then finally, and part of one of the most interesting to me parts of the study was we did stove usability focus groups with our participants, where we talked with them about their experience with the transition away from gas into electric induction, because we know that there's a lot of misinformation, misconceptions out there. There's a lot of propaganda that tells us that gas stoves are a superior, method of cooking. And we wanted to take from our participants of, their feelings about induction cooking after getting the experience of using one of these stoves. So very quickly, for those that might not know, what is an induction stove? An induction stove is an electric stove, but before, I think when a lot of people hear electric stove, they think of older versions of electric stoves that have the coil and they're really bad and they take a long time to heat up and they don't cook your food evenly, and they're overall just poor quality. Induction stoves are far, far advancement from that. So induction stoves actually use electromagnetic energy to cook your food. So what that means is that you need to have a pot that is induction ready, and all that means is that it's magnetic. And when you put it on the stove, when you put it on the burner, it basically turns the stove on, and is an electromagnetic transition between the pot and the stovetop, and that's what heats the pot. And so it's incredibly efficient. There's no wasted energy because you're not heating a coil that then's heating the pot on top of it. It cooks your food incredibly evenly. You have really nice control over the temperatures. It's an overall really wonderful way to cook food. And it's far better than an electric stove that you're thinking of. And it's a large step forward from a gas stove, which, you know, not only loses energy when it's cooking because it, again, is just a flame heating a pot, it's also releasing, you know, a lot of these really bad indoor air pollutants that are harmful to your health. I will say, quick side note here, I've grown up in New York. I have grown up with a gas stove my entire life. I one time did believe that gas stoves were the superior form of cooking fuel. I was able to use the induction stoves that we gave to our participants, and I can 150% say that I'm a full convert. It was so nice to cook on. It was such a good quality. It was efficient. It really like made me realize that I have been misled for a very long time. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the results. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the long-term air monitoring. So the box that you see on the side is actually the air monitoring box that we used in our study. It's called the Home Health Box. It's a product by AST Aspen. Access Sensor Technologies, excuse me, that's the AST. And this box can read, like I said, nitrogen dioxide and carbon monoxide in real time. And so we installed these in participants' home for a week at a time, 3 different times over the course of 10 months. And what we found is that just by removing a gas stove from people's homes, we saw a 30% drop in nitrogen dioxide concentrations. That's just removing one appliance. So you think about that. That's a very significant drop just based off of the stove. This was, again, not controlling for people's activities or what they did in their homes. It was really just taking, you know, a week snapshot of their air quality for that week. And we were able to track this progress, which was pretty significant. One of the limitations that I did want, oh, sorry, I might have misordered my slides. Okay, that's okay. I did want to touch quickly on, actually, you know what, I did misorder my, no, I didn't. Okay, that's okay. I wanted to touch on some of like the realities of this pilot and things that we learned while we were doing it. Assessments of the building. So this is, again, an old building, and we found that the electrical capacity was not able to handle more than 2 induction stoves per vertical line. So what that means is that this is a 6-story building, and on any vertical line, so we can say apartment 1A, 2A, 3A, 4A, 5A, 6A, was all fed by a common wire. And so if we put more than 2 of these stoves on that line, we risked actually blowing out the power to the whole line. And so that was a challenge for us in organizing the pilot, but that's also a challenge for the New York City Housing Authority that's planning to fully electrify this building. It is going to require substantial electrical work, which is expensive. And so that's important for us to be thinking about when we're talking about older buildings that need to go through these transitions. You know what, I'm so sorry. I think that this slide did get out of order, but I'm going to talk about the second slide in a little bit, so I will skip that right now. And the other thing that is worth, again, needs to be mentioned is that when we're dealing with older housing and older multifamily buildings, there's a lot of deferred maintenance that people are dealing with or living with that need to be addressed before you can even begin to talk about electrifying their appliances. And at Watson, we were working with participants whose houses were dealing with leaks, that was growing mold. They had plumbing issues, and those all need to be addressed before you can reach the electrification starting line. And so we really need to be making investments in our building, especially our public housing, but all of our older buildings, to get them to the place where they can really start to embrace some of this new technology. So I'm so sorry. Okay, this was a slide that I wanted to talk to you all about, so I apologize for jumping around. We have a lot of information on this pilot. But I do want to just switch back to the long-term air monitoring, taking in all the issues with the building into context. We did see the 35% reduction in daily nitrogen dioxide concentrations. Again, that's really impressive considering this is just looking at the transitioning the stove from gas to electric. We also found that the highest concentrations of nitrogen dioxide were eliminated when you removed the gas stove from the home and you put in an induction stove. What we were finding is that households with gas stoves were being exposed to nitrogen dioxide concentrations that are above what is considered safe for outdoor air exposure set by the EPA's Air Quality Index. So I want to touch on this point really quickly because in the United States, we don't have indoor air quality standards. So basically, there's no regulations of how polluted your air quality can be inside, but there are standards for how polluted the air quality can be outside. And what we were finding is that air quality inside was actually worse than what's allowed outside. And that's a problem. And that is, an area for future policy change. We also found when talking about carbon monoxide that there was also a significant decrease in carbon monoxide exposure. So households with a gas stove were being exposed to about 1.4 parts per million of carbon monoxide. And homes with induction stoves, that dropped to about 0.8 parts per million. I will say that neither of those amounts are considered, above what is something that would be concerning. They're both below what is legally allowed, but it's still important to see that we are decreasing our exposure to a really harmful indoor air pollutant. So talking about the indoor air quality again, I'm going to show us a graph in a minute that kind of looks at how air quality compared to these different standards that we have. So again, like I said, the United States has no indoor air quality standards. And so what we had to use was the outdoor standards, which you see on the left. And this is really looking at when concentrations of air pollution increase and the risk that they pose to different populations. Because we were looking at air quality inside of people's homes, we wanted to see when nitrogen dioxide concentrations went from good to moderate. Because again, this is for outside and we're looking at inside. So we wanted to just see when air quality went from good to moderate. We also were using the World Health Organization's 24-hour indoor air quality guidelines for nitrogen dioxide, which is 13 parts per billion. So the World Health Organization says you should not be exposed to more than 13 parts per billion of nitrogen dioxide in a 24-hour period. So what we did was looked at our apartments that were in our study and looked at when they were at or below what the World Health Organization says is safe, which is what you'll see in green. We wanted to look at when they were above what the EPA says is moderate for outdoor exposure, which is in red. And then the yellow is when they're in between. So the air quality inside was worse than what is allowed by the World Health Organization, but is not as bad as what the EPA considers safe for outside or unsafe for outside. I know this is a little bit confusing, but stick with me. This is looking at the 10 households. So the 10 on the left had their gas stove for the entire study. So again, we wanted to study the transition. So 10 households kept their gas stove throughout the 10-month period, and then we gave them the induction stove at the end. While the other 10 households received, did the first round of air monitoring with their gas stove and then switched to an induction stove and were able to keep their induction stove, obviously in perpetuity. The gas stove, why we did it this way is so that we could have a control to compare the change over time between the gas and the induction. But what we were finding is that while you can see the highest concentrations of NO2, where it was basically considered unsafe for outdoor air exposure, you see that red in the households with the gas stoves. They are facing hours in the day where they are exposed to air quality that is worse than what's allowed outside. That virtually disappears when you're looking at the households with induction stoves, which is really great. However, we were surprised to see that there's a lot of hours during the day when folks with their induction stoves are still being exposed to nitrogen dioxide concentrations that's above what is considered safe set by the World Health Organization. And so this led us to discover that there are potential confounders in this building or other sources of nitrogen dioxide that are kind of seeping into people's apartments and still having an impact on their air quality, which is an important finding for us when we're talking about building electrification. Are we pushing just to remove gas stoves, or are we pushing for something more holistic that's really going to approach all the other potential sources of nitrogen dioxide, like the gas boiler in the basement, like the gas stoves in other people's apartments in the building, in order to have the biggest impacts on indoor air quality? So again, this interference from NO2, this impacted our daily readings, and this was definitely a an important discovery that highlighted some of the limitations of just doing a one-to-one intervention in a couple of apartments. And it really, for us, made the case that we need to be thinking holistically about full building electrification. All right, thank you for staying with me through all the disordering of my slides. I apologize for that. I'm gonna breeze through the next two because I have a feeling I'm close to time, but I want to talk about the results from our controlled cooking test. So really quickly, the controlled cooking test is a scientifically valid and repeatable protocol that scientists use all the time in research. Basically, we wanted to compare the air quality impacts between cooking on a gas stove versus an induction stove. And we controlled for as many variables as possible. So we controlled for the recipe of what we were cooking, the quantity of the food we were cooking, the heat that we were cooking on, the pots and pans that we were using. The only real difference was the type of stove that we used. And in real time, we were measuring nitrogen dioxide concentrations in folks' kitchens to understand what was happening to the air quality inside. We did this study, we cooked the same meal 18 different times. And we did it 9 times in households with gas stoves and 9 times in households with induction stoves. And what we found was pretty startling. So air quality in households with gas stoves on average went from 18 parts per billion, which is just like what we called background NO2. We were measuring NO2 before we even turned the stove on. And it jumped up at points to, on average, 197 parts per billion, which is incredibly high. And I will tell you that there were some households where we saw the nitrogen dioxide concentrations go up to 400 parts per billion, but the average was almost 200 parts per billion. That is still, so when we think about these EPA outdoor air quality standards, that is what the line here you see on this graph, the orange line, that is what the EPA considers unhealthy for sensitive groups. So sensitive groups are anybody that is an older adult, a younger child, or has a respiratory illness, which in the case of our pilot was 85% of our households. And for 43 out of 45 minutes that we were cooking this meal, the nitrogen dioxide concentrations were above what is considered unhealthy for sensitive groups. Meanwhile, when you look at the induction stoves on the right side, the nitrogen dioxide concentration stayed the same when we were measuring them before we turned the stove on to after we turned the stove on. We really saw no difference. And something that's, I think, again, really like kind of blew my mind a little bit, but is that on average, the households with gas stoves had nitrogen dioxide concentrations that were 190% higher than households with induction stoves. That's a lot of exposure to a really harmful indoor air pollutant in people's kitchens while cooking. Last but not least was the stove usability focus groups. And like I said, this was where we really sat down our participants and heard from them their experience transitioning from gas to induction. And I'm really happy to say out of all of the people that received the induction stove, not a single person wanted to go back to their gas stove. Everybody loved their induction stove universally. They preferred it to their gas stove, and they preferred it for reasons that we were, not necessarily expecting. We thought that they would like it for the health benefits, which they did, but they also liked it for the sense of relief and safety, not having gas in their homes, not having to worry about smelling gas, not having to worry about leaving the gas on. A number of our families had young children or pets, and having that relief of not having an open flame that could, start a fire or burn somebody was really, was a big relief. And people also just thought that the induction stove cooked food better. They thought that it was a much better experience. The food quality came out, they were always saying that their chicken came out browner and crispier, like everything about it was just a better experience for them. And our participants range in age from 25 to 84. They come from all different ethnic backgrounds, all different races, and every single person, the only universal thing among our participants is that they preferred the induction stove to gas stoves, which is a really important point for us, because I think, as I mentioned, there's a lot of propaganda out there from the gas industry that convince people gas stoves are superior. And this on its face proved that that's just simply not the case. So just to sum up some of our lessons learned, cooking with gas stoves can result in these really high concentrations of NO2 that are harmful to health. And that's particularly for these sensitive groups that I mentioned. These one-to-one appliance exchanges, they are going to improve indoor air quality in multifamily housing. As we said, just by removing the gas stove, we saw nitrogen dioxide concentrations drop by 35% on a day-to-day basis. However, Because of all these confounders that we discovered, the possibility that the boiler was interfering, neighboring apartments with gas stoves were interfering, we believe that transitioning entire buildings away from fossil fuels is going to have the greatest impact on indoor air quality. We also know that there needs to be a more diverse public relations campaign for induction cooking and building electrification. We couldn't find, for example, during our pilot, any materials on induction cooking that were in Spanish. We had to create all of that from scratch. And so we need to be getting this information out into communities of color so that they know that there are alternatives out there. And when we installed the first 10 stoves for our pilot, the number of people in the building calling us and asking us if they could get one of these stoves after seeing it and after getting exposure to it was astronomical. And so giving more communities exposure to this technology is going to have a really, really positive impact on adoption. We also have to acknowledge, as I mentioned, some of the building limitations. Low-income communities are more likely to live in older housing with deferred maintenance, structural deficiencies, and we are going to need significant investments and robust tenant protections to reach the electrification starting line, and also make sure that the people that deserve and need to have these interventions receive them. And so, you know, from our work in policy, we believe that government programs need to better package some of these building interventions so that people can do whole building retrofits. They can more holistically approach this project of electrifying their building, whether that's dealing with deferred maintenance, weatherizing the home, upgrading the wiring, you know, getting rid of toxins, and replacing appliances. If programs can help people do that all together, we're going to have a higher success rate, and we're going to have more equitable delivery of electrification. Really quickly, because I don't want to scare people, I still live in a house with a gas stove. I don't have a window in my kitchen. I have just a vent. And so we do want to give folks some like tips that we have learned from the researchers that we work with in our own studies. You know, if you do have a gas stove, how you can reduce indoor air pollution in your home. If you have a window in your kitchen, open it when you cook. If you have a vent in your kitchen, use it when you cook. It's going to help reduce the concentration of these air pollutants. Absolutely under no circumstances, do not heat your apartment with your oven. Just anecdotally, we saw huge spikes in NO2 concentrations over the winter time. And people were, you know, telling us, yes, I had used my stove to cook. I used my oven to heat my apartment during those weeks when you were monitoring. And so, you know, I know that many people live in housing that doesn't have adequate heating. Look towards electric space heaters. They have their problems, but they're safer for your health than using your oven. And then also we are encouraging people, you know, to the best of your ability, transition to electric appliances. They have some really great appliances out there that are not very expensive, from toaster ovens, air fryers. You can buy induction hot plates to kind of start practicing and learning how to use an induction stove. And anything that you can use to prevent turning on your stove is going to help your indoor air quality. And then last but not least, before we hand it over to questions, you know, We Act is a policy advocacy organization. We did this pilot, and now we want to use what we have found and really implement change and make sure that we are increasing the speed and adoption of electrification, induction stoves, full building retrofits in low-income housing specifically, and in communities of color. And so we have kind of 4 policy buckets that I'm not going to get too deep into, but I'm happy to answer questions about. A lot of these are focused on New York State, but some of them have a federal orientation. We really, like I said, want to restructure existing programs to be more holistic. In New York State, there's, you know, 80 different programs to kind of help you solve one piece of the puzzle of building electrification, and it can be really confusing for landlords and homeowners to participate. So we need to see some of that bundling to make these programs more effective. We also need to meet the needs of low-income renters, many of whom have limited autonomy over their housing conditions. So, you know, New York City, 70% of our residents are renters. And if you don't own your home, you're very limited in the updates and upgrades that you can make. And so we want policies to be more accessible for renters. We also want to push the Housing and Urban Development Agency at the federal level to accelerate decarbonization efforts in their buildings. New York City has the largest public housing portfolio in the country. but there's public housing all across the United States, and they are really being left behind in this process. And that is another reason why we wanted to work with New York City Housing Authority. And we saw that there are a lot of challenges that their buildings are going to face as they continue to try and electrify their existing building portfolio. And then last but not least, we act as really advocating to get fossil fuels out of homes. It is abundantly clear that it is unsafe to be burning fossil fuels to heat or to cook inside of our homes. And there are better alternatives out there. And so we want to make sure that people have access to those and are safe, from, what we have considered, normal or the status quo for so long, but is really just making us sick. And so thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Annie. That was a great presentation. I learned so much. And yeah, like you said, we're opening it up to questions now. So I see there's some questions in the Q&A box. If you haven't dropped your question, please feel free to add it there. And also, if you'd like to raise your hand and unmute to ask your question live, feel free to do that, and I can unmute you as well. So let's get started with these questions. So one of the questions that came through a couple of times was around the talking points you use to kind of get buy-in around switching from gas to induction stoves. So do you have any tips? Were there any talking points that you use to kind of combat the kind of preconceived notions, whether it comes from the cultural background that people use or have when it comes to using their gas stoves, or the fact that maybe they haven't seen any health issues with their gas stove being in their home? So anything to answer that question.
Yeah, recruitment was really interesting because so the community that we in this building, I would say there's a lot of people who come from Latinx communities. There's a lot of Spanish speakers, and then there's a lot of people who are, born and raised in New York. And so when we were recruiting people to try and participate in this pilot, we at first led with health. We want to give you this stove, and it's, we're trying to do this indoor air quality monitoring, blah, blah, blah. And that wasn't really resonating with people. And so when then we started just talking about the stove and the quality of the stove, I think that a huge benefit for us, and this is a reality of public housing in New York City, is that many people were cooking on stoves that were 30 to 40 years old, and they were really leaky. They didn't work very well. Many people needed to use matches to light their stoves. And so the prospect of having an updated new appliance, and we conducted, a couple of cooking demos at a neighboring organization where we would actually bring people over to see how the stove works and to get to kind of practice using it. And that was really what won a lot of people over. That was what I think convinced folks that they wanted to participate. Something that we did also in our recruitment promise was that if for any reason at the end of the study you want your gas stove back, we did save all of the gas stoves and said, we'll install it, no questions asked at the end of the pilot if you want it back. And I'm happy to report, as I said, not a single person took us up on that offer. Everyone really preferred using the induction stove. But I think, one thing that I want to highlight, and my partner in crime is not here, but I did all of the outreach with a participating weatherization organization called Association for Energy Affordability. They had been in the building prior to us doing this pilot, doing some weatherization upgrades. So replacing some windows, putting on new shower heads. And the outreach staff at that organization, they were bilingual, they were from the neighborhood. They were able to build really great rapport with building residents and build a level of trust so that when we came back and we're doing our outreach for this pilot, they knew my partner, Michelle, they trusted her, they knew that she was not going to do wrong by them. And so that made it really easy just to have, somebody who can speak and relate to you on a level that maybe I cannot as somebody coming into your neighborhood to help with recruitment. And that is like incredibly important and was integral to the success of our pilot.
Love that. Thank you for sharing that. It's really helpful. And then we have these questions kind of around the choice to use the induction stove versus flat top electric stoves, and whether or not folks need to switch out their pots and pans, what that process was like, the cost around switching those things out, if you can answer to that.
Yeah, so we opted for the induction stove because we knew that it was a much better quality than cooking with electric. We knew that it was also a cost savings. So one of the challenges of working with the New York City Housing Authority is that tenants are not responsible to pay their utility bills. The Housing Authority pays those. And so we couldn't do a real cost benefit analysis of how much do people's utility bills go up when they're transitioning from a gas stove, where gas is heavily subsidized by our federal and state governments, to an electric stove that is not as subsidized, and so it's more expensive. We did take a lot of our stove use data that we collected and did our own analysis, and found that by switching from a gas to an induction stove, people's utility bills would only go up on average about $6 per month. And that is because the induction stove is so efficient. So when we did our controlled cooking test, we were cooking spaghetti, broccoli, and cookies and tomato sauce. That was like the standard meal that we made. We could cook that entire meal on an induction stove in on average like 23 minutes, where on the gas stove, it would take us about 48 to 54 minutes. So we were cutting the time that we were cooking in half. These induction stoves are incredibly powerful. They can boil a pot of pasta water in like 3 minutes. So that was ultimately why we opted for the induction stove. But I will say not a huge issue, but I think an important learning lesson was the replacing of the pots and pans. Through our pilot, we purchased everybody who participated a 14-piece set of new Cuisinart pots and pans. And we believe wholeheartedly that if we're going to expand these efforts and we want to give more low-income or fixed-income households induction stoves, you absolutely have to include the pots and pans, because that is too much of a cost barrier for somebody who's on a fixed income to replace all of their cooking equipment. And there were some of our participants had their favorite rice pot that wouldn't, work with an induction stove. And that was something that we did have to kind of grapple with and try and figure out some solutions. And ultimately it was, just that, the stove can't work with that pot. And so here are new pots. And I will say that was maybe a concern for like a week, and then we never heard about it again. And I do really attest that to the fact that people were having such a better experience cooking on this new stove, that they were able to overcome some of these shortfalls or concerns that they might have with letting go of certain like culturally relevant pots and pans.
Great, thanks for sharing that. And another question, do you have any examples of strong tenant protections against displacement as a result of upgrades or higher energy costs, or policy recommendations on helping tenants better access the benefits of electrification, given the barriers they often face in making upgrades to their home?
Yes, that's a great question. And I will answer the beginning part, and I might need you to repeat the second part. But in New York State right now, there has been a really, really hard push for legislation called good cause eviction. And what good cause eviction would do is it would basically grant the right to a lease renewal to every tenant in New York State, regardless of, to every tenant in New York State, unless that landlord has good cause for eviction. So unless you have broken your lease, you are basically guaranteed the right to a lease renewal. And the rent increases on your unit are capped at a certain amount tied to the consumer price index. We have been pushing for this bill for many years, and the environmental justice movement as a whole has really backed this bill in the past year more intentionally, because we know that as landlords either receive public subsidy or start to do these upgrades to their buildings themselves, they're going to pass those costs on to tenants, and they're going to increase rents, and they're going to displace the very people that deserve these upgrades the most. And so we of course know that a lot of landlords, especially in multifamily housing, can't pay for these upgrades themselves. And that's why WeAct has been advocating for improved public programs that will help pay for a lot of this work, because it is expensive. We're not going to sugarcoat that. But what can't happen is that a landlord takes public dollars and then evicts the low-income people in their building and increases the rent to take in higher income people after improving conditions and probably addressing deferred maintenance that they may have let sit there for years and years and years. And so We Act has been really pushing for good cause eviction because we know that there's no justice in our just transition platform if we're not ensuring that tenants can stay in their homes. I do want to shout out New Jersey because New Jersey has had good cause eviction type legislation in place since I think 1974. So are really leaders, and I think Newark has one of the lowest eviction rates in the country. And so kudos to our neighbor, and New York is way behind, and needs to make sure that we are thinking about this whole, housing justice and environmental justice. They're not separate.
Definitely. Thank you for that. That's really great. And then the second part of the question is just around any policy recommendations for helping tenants access the benefits of electrification, which you sort of touched on.
Yeah, this is a great question. And all I would say is our full report, which I can, I'm going to post the link in the chat where you can download the full report. There's also a really wonderful 3-minute video of our participants talking about their experiences with the stove. Our report has a lot of suggestions that are focused on New York State policies, but New York State programs, but we do want to open access to many of the programs that exist across, other states, as well as some of the federal programs to ensure that renters can apply to some of these programs themselves without landlord approval. And so, for example, if your building has the electrical capacity, and you want to replace your gas stove, you should be allowed to do that. And if it's at no cost to the landlord, you should be allowed to do that as a tenant, which, right now, in many places that's not allowed. I know myself, I live in a very drafty apartment, and if I could apply to a program to seal up my windows, I would in a heartbeat, but I would still, right now, I need my landlord's approval. And so those are kind of some of the barriers we would like to see removed.
That's great. Thank you. And then one question was about on your slide for the quotes from the participants, that last quote that was about wanting dignity and electrification. Can you kind of explain what that quote meant?
Yes, I wanted to include all the quotes, but I felt that I was running out of time to get to that piece. But the tenants that we worked with in public housing have had experiences in the past where they've been mistreated, and many of them have internalized that to be because they see they are low income, so they think that people don't think they deserve proper treatment. And that was something that happened in a couple of our apartments. We had to do some rewiring work inside of people's apartments. So we needed to install a 220 volt outlet in people's kitchens so that we could plug the stove in. And then we needed to put a 40 amp power breaker in people's apartments that kind of all connected through wiring. And 18 of the 20 apartments had excellent wiring. 2 of the apartments did. The people who came in did a sloppy job. There was wires hanging. And they felt disrespected in that process. And they wanted to give input to the people who are doing that to tell them where they believe the wire should run, because this is their home. They've lived there for 20, 30 years. And so this is a key piece that we do bring up more in the report, and we touch on more there where we have a little bit more time to talk about it. But we need to be making sure that this electrification process is done with respect, that we're giving tenants ample time, ample information about what is happening in their apartments, opportunity to weigh in on certain cosmetic things, so that we're not really like blindsiding people and giving them a negative experience. We want the electrification process to be a positive experience.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And then another question was around if you have any data on the percentage of air pollution that gas stoves contribute compared to gas burning space or water heaters. Was that something that you all looked at?
It's a great question, and it was not something that we looked at in this study, but I do want to say for future studies, We Act is hoping to do another similar project, but that looks at full electrification. So actually removing the boiler and replacing it with air source heat pumps, because we do have good reason to believe that so this building, it's 96 units. It has a central gas boiler and water heater in the basement. And we were seeing higher concentrations of nitrogen dioxide in homes that were on lower floors, and especially the homes that were in the back of the building where the boiler vented out. And so it's all hypothesis at this point in our studies, because we only looked at gas stoves. but we do want to do future research, and we hope that the methodology that we've set up here inspires other people across the country to do their own research that looks at full electrification and looks at what happens when you do remove that gas boiler and what happens to air quality inside of people's homes.
That's great. Awesome. And then there's just this question around like, what's next? You just touched on it a bit. Is there any other things that you guys are planning to do with this project? Are you going to do another pilot like this, or more that you want to share on your next steps?
Yeah, so, you know, WEACT is, as I mentioned, we are looking to continue to do some of this indoor air quality monitoring data analysis around electrification. I can't say too much yet because a lot of it's in the works, but I think in terms of what we found from this pilot is we want to make sure there's so many advocacy organizations that do a pilot, find all of these recommendations, and then move on to the next task at hand. And we really want to make sure that we're taking what we've learned from this and the policy recommendations that we've come up with, and make sure that they're implemented and that we are seeing better adoption of full building retrofits in low-income housing, which right now in New York State, we are a long way off from that. We are not seeing these programs reaching the most vulnerable communities. And so there's a lot of advocacy that we're doing right now at the city and the state level and the federal level, making sure that the Inflation Reduction Act is accessible for low-income renters. And there's also what's exciting is in the works, but is kind of a sister pilot to our Out of Gas and with Justice, is happening with a partner organization in Buffalo called Push Buffalo. And they are actually trying to do full building electrification of some multifamily housing in Buffalo, New York, and are replacing both gas stoves and boilers with induction stoves and heat pumps. And so that is kind of in the works and hopefully will be started in 2023. And that is, you know, a piece of research to look out for as kind of a follow-up to what we were doing.
That's super exciting. Can't wait to hear more about that one. And then, yeah, knowing what you know now, is there anything throughout this project that you all would have done differently that you can kind of give as best practice advice for other folks?
Yeah, you know, I think that we would have loved to have electrified the whole building. I think just by seeing the amount of, you know, influence, or I'm missing the word right now, but the amount of influence that these confounders had on our data on people's indoor air quality did surprise us. And there is, you know, it would have been a much larger project. It would have been a lot more difficult. It would have had a lot of great learning experiences and lessons to upgrade the electrical capacity of this entire building and replace the boiler and replace, you know, the gas stoves in all of the units. I think that would have been a much larger and harder project, but I think that as we found, and one of our key recommendations is that these one-to-one appliance swaps, switching out one gas stove for an induction stove, they do help, but the full building retrofit is what's going to have the biggest impact. And so we would love, you know, we would have definitely, I think, taken that into more consideration had we known just how impactful some of the, you know, leaving some of these appliances in people's homes was actually going to be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sharing that. And then there was a question around how you all sourced your air monitors. If you have any insights on like the best air monitors to use and what you guys use for your study.
Yeah, and I would like to, before I answer that, just give a shout out to the partners that we worked on this pilot with, because it would not have happened without, you know, the contributions of everybody. And we worked very closely on this pilot with the Association for Energy Affordability. They're a local weatherization agency. They helped us with outreach. They helped us with installing the induction stoves and the rewiring. We worked with Columbia University that helped us with the analysis. We worked with Berkeley Air Monitoring that helped us with, that really was the lead on the air monitoring. And they were the ones that helped us decide on the home health box through Access Sensor Technologies. So this pilot was the first time that those air monitors were used in a study. And so I will say air monitors are very expensive. They are not very accessible right now. And that is a problem. And that is something that is on the minds of a lot of very smart people as we are finding out just how polluted our air quality is. there's a real urgency and interest from people to be monitoring their outdoor and their indoor air quality. And so right now, I'm not super aware of like great options on the market for nitrogen dioxide monitors, but I would encourage if anybody has that information to share it in the chat. But nitrogen dioxide, when we're talking about gas stoves, is really the one you want to be looking at, because that is directly, gas stoves are the main contributor of nitrogen dioxide inside the home. And that one is that is the air pollutant that has really a negative health impact, especially on your respiratory and your breathing and your asthma. And so that is, that question has come up, and I wish we had a better answer. And it's something that we're definitely like advocating to see more like easier and better access to air monitoring.
That's great. Cool. And then one more question for you. Are there any opportunities for groups to plug in or support this work, or how can folks stay informed on what you're all doing?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to stay involved. So the first thing that I would recommend is signing up for our newsletter, because we give a summary every week of like ways that you can get involved, different working groups that We Act runs, different testimonies or comments that you can leave. Right now, we're really pushing for the Consumer Product Safety Commission at the federal level to regulate or apply or put appliance standards on gas stoves, because the amount of air pollution that we recorded in our study was just astronomical, and we need to do something about that. We need to act. We can't just sit on this data and say, oh, nothing, that's normal, because it's not. And so there's a comment period that, we're going to be sharing information about on our social medias and our website and in our newsletter. We also have working groups. So if you want to get involved, they are, there's a lot of people from Northern Manhattan in our working groups, but we also have folks from all over the place join us. And we have a Healthy Homes working group that's looking at indoor air quality specifically. I run the Climate Justice working group. So we're talking about housing justice and a just transition, and, getting our buildings off of fossil fuels, getting our energy grid off of fossil fuels. And so I will, if you go to our website, you should find how to sign up for the newsletter. And I'm going to also drop my email in the chat. And if anyone wants to email, definitely I'm happy to connect you with the right person at our organization. But I would also encourage, because I know folks on here are from all over the country, take a look at climate justice groups in your city, because there's some really fantastic groups doing important local work, and could definitely use support.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Annie. And I'll also share links to your website and ways to get involved in our follow-up materials. But yeah, that brings us to the end. I am going to drop our post-event survey in the chat. Please take that to let us know how you like the event and what more you'd like to see. Thank you again, Annie, for sharing with us and spending this time with us. I learned so much, and I'm so excited to see what you all do next. As I said, I'll send out the recording of today's event and some resources by the end of this week, and so you'll be hearing from us soon. If you have any further questions, feel free to either email me or Annie, or leave your comments in the post-event survey, and we can follow up that way as well. And I thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Thanks, Annie.